Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 1 of Technically Speaking. My name is Brandon Burton, and I will be your host today as we talk about monitoring moisture in less time with better data. A couple of things here before we get started, just so everybody's aware, the chat function is not active during the webinar today, but the Q&A section is. And we're going to go through about 40 minutes of material here talking about the monitoring process. And if you have a question that you'd like to ask as we go through, just drop it into the Q&A. And at the end of the session, for those of you that are with us live today, we'll go through an active kind of virtual open mic with a Q&A session for as long as it takes to get through the questions that are asked. If you're watching this recorded after we publish it, the Q&A session will not be available. So for those of you that are catching up on these sessions afterwards, we highly encourage you catch them live because we have some wonderful Q&A sessions. So with that, again, let's get started with Technically Speaking, episode 1, Monitoring Moisture. Again, my name is Brandon Burton. I'm the Vice President of Technical Application here at NextGear and CoreLogic. I'm also the chair of the ANSI IICRC standards, and a lot of what I'm incorporating into these Technically Speaking series webinars is going to come from that standards background. You'll hear me refer to that quite a bit, especially with topics like we're going to cover off on today with monitoring and monitoring moisture. To get us going with the monitoring subject, first and foremost, I want to talk a little bit about the reason why monitoring is a struggle for a lot of us in our businesses. It's interesting because monitoring is one of those areas in water damage mitigation where we feel like we're kind of torn in two different directions. On one side, we want to make sure that we're getting better data, better information. And this is becoming more and more important in our industry as we move forward because standards are increasing, the knowledge of the consumer is increasing, program work is increasing. A lot of things are changing and moving such that data is becoming more and more important to justify decisions that are made, not only to ensure that the right decisions are being made, but to justify them clearly, to try to eliminate questions and concerns about the work that was done and why it was done a particular way. We'll talk a lot about why that's so important here in just a moment. But the challenge with that is that better data typically means that we're spending more time collecting that data. And monitoring is not one of those processes where we want to spend an exorbitant amount of time. It's not a very profitable line item in the process of water damage mitigation. And generally speaking, we've got to get in and out of projects, especially in the monitoring phase. We need to get in and out of projects quickly so we can monitor multiple projects, especially when business really ramps up. And we're in the middle of a weather event, whether regional or national, and we have a lot of projects and a lot of volume that we need to work through. So how do we solve this quandary of getting better data, better information, but spending less time collecting that information and documenting that information? So how do we find that balance? In order to find that balance, I need to dive into the 5 whys. If you remember in the kind of the opening pilot session, we talked about making sure you ask the question why, right? And with monitoring, I want to go through that same exercise. Why do we monitor moisture to begin with? Well, the core reason for it is that we want to verify progress, right? We want to validate that the equipment that we're using, any manipulation we made to the structure in terms of the assemblies and components, any of this that was done was effective, right? And we're moving in the right direction with the overall drying process. So we want to verify progress, kind of the heart of monitoring, right? The change and observing that change. But why do we want to verify progress? Why is progress so important? The reason why progress is so important is because water does not cause most of the damages that we see in water damage. I want you to just kind of ponder that for a second. Water doesn't cause the damage. What causes the damage is the water that is there for an extended period of time. It's time that is the catalyst for that water damage. Most materials, when you wet them, if you immediately remove the moisture that was added, very little, if any, damage is going to occur. Of course, there's some exceptions to some types of building materials, but with most materials, if it is only wet for a matter of minutes, there'll be virtually no damage, even a matter of hours. But when we get into a matter of days and weeks and months, we have exceptional amounts of damage that can occur. So really the heart of verifying progress is to ensure that we're preventing these damages from occurring. Because as long as we're drying and we're moving in a positive direction, most of those damages can be alleviated. I want to use one damage in particular, and that's the growth of microorganisms and mold. Mold is not something that occurs in the face of progress. If a building material is drying, releasing its moisture, in order for that to occur, we've got to be removing the humidity from the surface, something we call a boundary layer in layman terms, but removing that water activity right at the surface with air movement and replacing it with dry air to sustain the drying progress. If progress is happening, that means we're removing that water activity and we're eliminating the potential for microbial growth. So even just in that one specific example, if I can validate that a building material is making progress, then I can also validate that I'm preventing mold growth from occurring. So lots of reasons why verifying progress is critical. But why is preventing damage important? We want to prevent damage because it benefits all stakeholders of the process. It manages the risk associated with additional damages to the property owner, the severity to an insurance carrier, and the overall cost of the project, and the liability to you, right? If a project did not have the damage when we take over the project, but because of lack of drying, lack of progress, lack of movement, damages begin to occur, then I have a certain amount of liability and exposure to that, right? Because I had custody of the project when those damages occurred. At the very minimum, I've got a lot of explaining to do, a lot more documentation to do. And at the end of the day, my final why is that is going to impact the bottom line, right? The dollars and cents. If more damages are occurring, more building materials are no longer salvageable, then that impacts me from a dollars and cents standpoint in a couple of different ways. First of all, I'm much more profitable drying a project than I am reconstructing and demolishing a project in the opposite order, right? My average profitability from demolition and reconstruction, if you're lucky, is going to hit double digits, if you're lucky. My average profitability from a drying perspective, removing moisture from building materials and restoring those materials through equipment rentals, et cetera, very easily double digits. I won't get into exact numbers because every business is different, but you are far more profitable drying than you are replacing. So it hits me in the dollars and cents if I can monitor properly, because monitoring properly allows me to restore those materials. The other place that it hits me from a dollars and cents standpoint is that if I'm not making progress, things are going sideways, we have to make several adjustments in the project, and ultimately am not able to dry building materials effectively, or at least not document that they are, and we have to go from drying to demolition to reconstruction and do all the explaining that comes along with that. My accounts receivable are going to get extended, right? It takes more time to collect in that type of process than it does just in the mitigation process itself. So lots of reasons why it's going to hit me from dollars and cents. So again, that's kind of asking the 5 whys. Why do we monitor? To verify progress. Why is progress important? To prevent damage. Why is preventing damage important? Because it mitigates risk, liability, severity. Why is all of that important? Because it makes me more profitable, right? So that's the reason why here in episode 1, I chose to start off with monitoring moisture and how to get us there to the better data, more reliable information while spending less time doing it. So with all that said, let's talk a little bit about what monitoring is, right? Really simple and kind of preaching to the choir here, but monitoring is basically collecting data as it relates to moisture in the building. And there's 2 sides to the data, right? There's the data that is the air, the temperatures and humidities and grains per pound and things like this that we typically get with a thermal hygrometer. And then there's the obtaining the moisture readings in materials and finding out what the moisture level is in the plywood, in the drywall or sheetrock, in the framing materials, et cetera, et cetera. So 2 sides to the data. Once the data is collected, the second hand of that is then documenting that data, right? Whether that be pen and paper and collecting that information that way or collecting it digitally. Today's session is going to focus on both ends of the spectrum, by the way. We're going to start off talking about the data itself and the instruments and the process for collecting data. And then we're going to kind of wrap the session up today talking about the digital versus paper. Every business is different, but I want to give you the questions that you need to ask of your organization to understand where your emphasis should be within your organization. So with that said, let's get into the process. Okay, the process requires that we understand a couple of terms. Being effective in monitoring moisture requires a very specific mindset. And to understand that mindset, I want to define a couple of terms for you. The first term I want to define is the term inspection. All right. Inspection is what we do first. Inspection is the mindset where I'm going into a property and I'm trying to understand to infinite detail the exact project that I'm about to begin. And there's a lot of information we gather in inspection. Not all of it's related to moisture, right? Some of it has to do with the age of the building, what kind of safety and risks are associated with the property. Inspection even means collecting information about the occupants of the space, right? And what impact they may have on the project itself and what interests or concerns may affect the project from that perspective. So a lot of information we collect in inspection, but just to zero in on the moisture side of it, I want you to think of inspection like a picture, okay? Versus monitoring, I want you to think of it like a video in this analogy I'm going to walk through. In a picture, what makes a really good picture? A really good picture is an image that is going to be highly detailed, right? A really good camera that takes a really good picture has got lots and lots and lots of pixels, and we're getting lots of information. The problem is that information is only about a single point in time, right? A really good image that shows me exactly what is happening at that exact moment in time. And if I were to take a picture of an Indy 500 or a 500-meter relay or whatever it is, and take just a picture at that specific moment in time, I might be able to tell who's in front and who's behind, but I can't tell how fast anybody's moving. So it'd be really hard for me to make a projection about where we're going to finish or who's going to finish first. Whereas with monitoring, it's more like a video. In a video, I'm taking multiple observations, and in those multiple observations, I get the ability to understand what direction we are headed, right? But in order to do that, I have to be highly consistent. If the camera is moving with what I'm filming, it's hard for me to understand the rate of speed, right? So consistency becomes absolutely critical in the monitoring side. And again, we're going to dive into each of these in infinite detail as we move forward. Let's drill in a little bit deeper into the inspection side. So let's take this, this really simple drawing here of a room, and let's talk a little bit about what the inspection process might look like in this room. First of all, inspection is a lot of detail, right? And if it's a lot of detail, that means that I'm going to be checking lots of things throughout the space. Lots of surfaces, lots of areas, lots of materials, lots of instrument readings, lots and lots of detail. And that's all the little pixels rather that are in the picture, right? So very highly detailed to give me that single point in time understanding of what's transpiring in that space. As I do that, the second set of definitions I want to share with you today become really, really important. This is probably one of the biggest mistakes that I see made in documentation that comes back from the field. Most people focus on assemblies, all right? We don't inspect, we don't monitor assemblies. Assembly would be a wall, a floor, a ceiling, a cabinet, a sofa, right? These are items that are comprised of multiple components. It's the component that needs to be inspected. It's the component that needs to be monitored. And when we see a wall or a floor or a ceiling, we have to think about that assembly as its components. What is it comprised of, right? Because it makes a huge difference from one wall as an assembly to the next if the components are different. They're going to wet differently, they're going to dry differently, they're going to damage differently. All of those things will be very, very different. Therefore, the way that I'm going to monitor them will also be different, right? What I anticipate to be challenges will be very, very different. Even the equipment I use to dry them may be very, very different. So we have to break it down to the component level. And if you catch yourself on your inspection or monitoring forms calling things a wall or a floor or a ceiling or a couch, if you're using terms like that, then really step back and ask yourself, what am I actually putting my instrument on? What am I actually measuring? And is it the right piece of that assembly, right? Am I measuring the right thing in that assembly to understand if it's truly making progress, or what I'm actually concerned about being wet to begin with? In other words, when you look at an assembly, it's got lots of pieces, right? And this just as an example, you may have a wall assembly that has a finish layer to it like paint. It's going to have some sort of a skin or underlay that's down beneath that, whether that's sheetrock or whatever else. Then you have a structure to it, maybe 2x4 framing and a plate, may even have some insulation. And that's just on the simple side, right? There could be a lot more to it than that. So identify what those components are. And here I'm just going to give you a couple of examples in the inspection process We've identified an area of migration in a simple room. We've got a couple areas of wall. We've got an area of floor. But again, those are the assemblies. This is what the components would look like. So this wall in this particular example, 5/8 gypsum, latex interior paint, 2x4 dimensional wood framing, et cetera, et cetera. That's breaking it down to the component level. And again, the reason this is so important is because when I begin my monitoring process, if I don't understand what all these parts and pieces are and ask myself some really critical clarifying questions about what in this is going to be most challenging to dry, what am I most concerned about drying, if I don't understand at this level, I'm going to monitor the wrong thing. And by monitoring the wrong thing, I'm going to either add lots of complexity to the project, or I'm going to miss moisture and leave a building wet. So really important to break it down to this level. In addition, here we have the floor, just as another example. We're breaking each one of these assemblies down layer by layer or component by component to understand how they're comprised, right? So monitoring. So how does monitoring look different than inspection, right? Inspection was a picture, infinite detail, high resolution, know exactly where we are at a given point in time. Monitoring, on the other hand, is taking that area that is affected, where moisture has migrated, that we identified through the inspection process, and narrowing that down to the handful, and we can debate what handful means in just a moment, but handful of locations where it's most critical for me to understand if we're making progress. And generally speaking, the selection of these locations is going to be based on a couple of different criteria. Where, first of all, are we wet, right? That's got to be criteria number one. Criteria number two, which of these components are going to be the most difficult to dry, to remove moisture from? And I'll give you a really good example of this. If I've got carpet and pad over a plywood subfloor, and I'm going to leave the carpet and pad in place, I'm not concerned about the moisture in the carpet and pad because of their very, very high porosity, very high permeability. I'm going to use the subfloor as my target, and I'm not going to continue to monitor the pad and the carpet if the subfloor itself is making progress. Because if the more difficult material inside the assembly is drying, then the materials that encase it are also drying. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into some specific examples later. So monitoring, in order to understand if we're making progress, I'm going to drill you into a very specific example. Let's say that we go in on day 3, right? And we grab a meter, whatever that meter is, and we, at a particular point on a particular material in an assembly, we obtain a value of 59, right? Is 59 good? Is 59 bad? Well, we're missing all kinds of information to know what it really means, right? The first piece of information that we're missing is, what is it supposed to be, right? And that would be something about dry standards and drying goals, and we're going to talk about all those in a future episode. The other thing that I'm missing is what we talked about in the pilot episode, right? We measure twice. No reading by itself has any value when you look at it by itself. There always needs to be a point of comparison. To know if it is wet, I need those dry standard and drying goals. But for monitoring purpose, I need to know, what was it yesterday, right? And then again, what is it tomorrow? 59 is wonderful if we started at 98, right? 59 is horrible if we started at 32. So what were we in the prior days? What are we tomorrow? But this only works, and here's the big catch. This only works if all of these things are consistent. And this is where we break down as an industry. Meter, make, and model needs to be the same. When you measure the 98 and you measure the 59, it's got to be the same make, the same model, potentially even the same exact meter, and we'll talk about that in a second. The meter setting and scale need to be the same. The location the meter is placed needs to be as precisely the same as possible. The depth, if you're using pins, need to be the same. The type of attachment you are using. Even the angle and orientation of your meter, believe it or not, especially in your non-invasive meters, even the angle and orientation of that instrument and how it's being held need to be the same. And if you're unsure about any of this, or maybe this is new information to you, I absolutely challenge you, grab a 2x4, all right, and set it in some moisture for a day or two, and then grab your non-invasive moisture meter and measure that moisture in that 2x4 by holding the meter different ways at different angles. You're going to get different readings every time, right? And think about how problematic that is to the monitoring process. Right? If Bob holds it one way and Sue holds it another way, you're going to get different values because they're monitoring differently, right? They're not holding the camera the same way, which sounds a little overwhelming when you first think about it, right? We'll talk about solutions for that in a second, but All of these things need to be consistent. In order for monitoring to indicate if we're making progress, to prevent damage, to mitigate risk and liability, and salvage your profitability, all those reasons why monitoring is so important. In order for that to deliver to your organization, this has to be consistent across the board. It has to be done the same way. Okay. So monitoring is about consistency. So let's talk a little bit about that make and model thing here for just a second. Let's say we've got, several trucks, several kits, several technicians that are out monitoring in the field. The reality of water damage mitigation is that you may have, technician Tom out there on day one doing the initial setup and taking the initial readings, but Sue is the one that's scheduled to do the monitoring the next day because Tom was on call last night and he's not going to go out the next day to the same job, which means Sue's probably not bringing the same kit, right? It's not the same exact set of instruments. So how do you manage that in your organization to make sure that you can still effectively monitor? And a big piece of that is doing what I call meter maintenance. And meter maintenance basically means just taking kit A and kit B and keep going, C, D, E, and F, and making sure that, first of all, they're the same make and model. And that you can't avoid. Right? In your organization, you should be committed to the same make and model for all of your inspection kits. If you're not on the same make and model, then unfortunately, where you had a protimeter on day one, you're going to have to just stick with the protimeters in your business day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5. And if you got some Tramexes in your business, those can be on other jobs and they can continue to be used on other jobs, but they can't be mixed on the job where you had the protimeter. Right? You've got to stick at least with the same make and model because the calibration scales are just way too different from one make and model to the next. But if you can commit to one make and model in your organization, that's okay. You don't have to bring out the same exact kit every day as long as you do the meter maintenance. And the meter maintenance is basically just once a month, taking the different kits out and measuring the same material in the same place with each one of the kits and making sure that those numbers are within a reasonable approximation of each other. Usually within at least a percentage point at the very most. Deviation is what I would accept personally, but make sure that they are in agreement with one another. And if they are, you can interchange them from job to job. Wonderful. Okay, do that for each setting and scale, by the way, and make sure that they are the same. If you have one that's way out in left field, it's time to be recalibrated, replaced, or at least designated as a meter that would be used as the only meter on a given project. It's all right if the meter's off calibration as long as it's not mixed with other instruments. That goes back to dry standards and drying goals. And again, we'll talk about that another day. Okay. So with that said and done, meter maintenance, just making sure that your instruments agree. It's a critical part of ensuring consistency in the way in which we're monitoring these projects. I'm going to drill a little bit deeper into consistency and talk a little bit about how some other methods we can use to be consistent in monitoring. As I do, though, I want to pause watching the Q&A window over here. And just a reminder for everybody, as I'm going through this, don't wait till the end to drop your questions in. If you've got a question as I'm going through, drop it in the Q&A so that it's there. When we hit the Q&A period at the end of this, I'm just going to start taking those in the order that they popped in. So make sure you're dropping your questions in as we go through for those that are with us live today. So with that, let's talk about some methods that help us instill consistency. I'm going to start with, one of the simplest ones out there that I think many of you on the call are probably using today, and that's just buying stock and blue painter's tape, right? Unfortunately, there's some pros and cons to this. First of all, let me start with this. I'm a large proponent. I'm a very strong supporter of using blue tape to indicate monitoring locations. I think there's lots and lots of benefit to it, but it has to be done right. There's a couple of things about quote unquote doing it right. First of all, don't try to put blue tape on carpet right after you extract it, right? It's going to be in a different corner of the room once you turn on your air movers. You've got to make sure that your surfaces are dry enough to allow the paint to adhere. Second of all, spend good money on good blue tape, right? You don't want to buy the blue tape that is the, I always go to Home Depot and they've got the good, better, best. And the good level blue tape is the stuff that when you peel it off, it takes the paint off. You need to buy the best, right? So make sure you're buying the stuff with good adhesive on it. And then third of all, you've got to have a process around how your meter is used with the tape, right? I want you to notice in this first image on the far left where my instrument is, all right? Then I want you to notice again where my instrument is in the second image. Then notice where my instrument is in the third image. Notice the consistency of where the reading is being taken in orientation to the tape. Now, how you do it in your organization and how you build that consistency, I'm not going to argue one way versus another as being best. What I am going to argue is this: the only right way is the same way as everybody else in the business. That's the one right way, okay? So whatever your method is, if it's immediately above the number and letter identifier on the edge of the tape, if that's your method, great, make sure everybody uses that same method. And it may sound a little nitpicky, but again, test this for yourself, right? Go grab a sheet of plywood, get it a little bit wet, and then the next day come back with an instrument and just move that instrument around a few inches. And notice the variation you get in readings, because this area of the grain is tighter. There's a knot, and on the other side over here, there is no knot, and the grain's a little more loose. It's going to dry differently. It's going to absorb differently. It's going to read differently. The wood in and of itself has a different electrical resistance. Just the nature of the wood's resistance is different in different areas. So for that reason, being consistent is key. It doesn't matter to me if the wood is actually 59% moisture content. That's not what's important to me. What's important to me is that that exact location went from 59 to 23. That's what's important to me, right? It's the progress. The numbers by themselves don't really mean anything to me. It's the change in numbers that do, and that only means something to me if I'm obtaining them in exactly the same way, okay? So consistency is key, right? Consistency is key. Another method for consistency that's been in the industry for some time that has some pros and cons, but I definitely want to highlight, is when we're using invasive meter measurements into especially wood materials. So here, let's say we got a couple of layers of plywood, just as an example, and I go into these couple layers of plywood using my invasive hammer probe, right? Pros and cons here. The pro is when I go in with something like this slide hammer electrode, is those pins that are going down in that material, typically they're insulated along the shaft of the pin and then only exposed at the very tip, which means as I penetrate these multiple layers of building material, I can read each layer independently, right? If the bottom is wetter than the top or vice versa, I'm going to know that using an instrument like this. This is that picture, right? Great detail, lets me understand where the moisture is most concentrated, highly valuable information for me to understand what my drying strategy is going to be and what I'm actually dealing with, because I know exactly where that water is. That would be a highly detailed method. The drawback to this is where exactly did they put their pins on the first day, right? And were their pins with the grain of the wood or perpendicular to the grain of wood, right? Another homework assignment for you. Take a slide hammer and slide that down into a piece of oak wood flooring, a little sample that you get from a store or something, measure across the grain and with the grain, right in the same spot. Just turn the pins. Notice the difference in the reading. It's a significant difference because there's more resistance across the grain than there is with the grain, right? So even something like that needs to be consistent, right? So this process, not highly consistent. What is consistent is taking a couple of wood screws, screwing those down into the plywood, and then coming back each day and monitoring right at the head of those screws, right? I know exactly where it is. It's where the screws are, right? I'm measuring the same exact depth, the same exact location, the same exact way. Highly, highly consistent. The drawback is I don't know where the water is, right? I don't know at what depth. Right, with something like this, unless you can go buy yourself some insulated screws that are only exposed at a particular depth, you're not going to know exactly where the water resides. But if I've inspected properly, I understand where the moisture is, I set up my drying strategy based on that, and then find the area where there's greatest concentration of moisture, insert the wood screws for the monitoring process, and then come back and monitor the worst news. The wettest point in that depth is what's going to be returned to that instrument. And if the wettest point is making progress, great. I'm not really concerned about what the driest point is doing, right? So it's a great monitoring method if I've inspected properly and I know where that greatest concern is, right? So inspection versus monitoring. Inspection on the left, great detail, right? Takes a little more time, a little more complicated, gives me great information. Do that the first day, understand what you're up against, understand what you're dealing with, and then select and identify the monitoring locations so you can spend less time collecting more solid data that is repeatable, reliable, and consistent so we ensure that we're making progress, okay? So inspection versus monitoring. Another way to kind of tackle all of this is to think about the monitoring process as a whole, kind of like a chain, right? Think of it like a chain, where each one of these links in the chain is something about the consistency of the process, right? Whether it be the instrument that was used, the setting it was on, the location that we're checking, making sure that one instrument agrees to the other. In order for this chain to be strong, all of those steps had to be done properly, right? They all had to be consistent. They all had to be addressed. If any one of those is not done properly, then this little 1 ton weight is going to give this guy a really bad day, right? So it's all about the consistency in that process. The consistency in that process, to me, the best way to address the challenges in your company that challenge that consistency are these 3 statements. First and foremost, there are an infinite number of right ways that you can monitor any given building material, right? 2x4, plywood, drywall, lots of right ways to do it. Right, lots and lots of right ways to do it. And in the consulting that I've done with restoration companies, this is the way that I always approach this. When we go into the meeting room with all the technicians on a Monday morning and we talk about, how we're going to get good at this, this is how I start the conversation. There are an infinite number of right ways to monitor any given building material. And the way you do it, Bob and Sue and Tim and Raphael, the way you guys do it, they're all great ways, right? There's nothing wrong with those ways. There's only one wrong way to monitor a building material. And that wrong way is differently than it was done on day 1. And think about that for a second. Whether you use Tim's or Raphael's or Bob's or Sue's method on day 1, whichever method it was, that's now the method that has to remain through that entire project. If I change the method, I change the value without the moisture changing. And I don't know if I'm making progress, right? Or I think I'm making progress and I'm really not. Or I think I'm not making progress and I really am, and I make a decision to tear something out that I shouldn't have, right? All of those are bad for the project. Every single one of those is bad for the project, except for consistent. So as an organization, as a business, the only way that you can really address this is to first get this message across, right? This exact message we just discussed. There's an infinite number of right ways. There's only one wrong way. It's different than it was done on day 1. Everybody's got to understand that. And once everybody understands that, then pick a method, right? And that now becomes our standard operating procedure. We monitor sheetrock or drywall in this way. We monitor a 2x4 wall plate in this way. We monitor plywood beneath carpet and pad in this way. This is the way that we do it. And the reason we had to pick one is because we all have to do it the same way. Like it, love it, hate it, doesn't matter. You don't have to love it, you just have to accept it, right? You don't have to agree with it, you just have to accept it, right? This is the way we do it. And the reason that's so important is because we need to validate progress, to avoid damage, to mitigate risk and liability so we can be profitable, right? That same 5 why, or actually I guess technically it's 4, but the same 4 whys we asked at the very beginning of the presentation. So consistency is key. And I can't tell you, I cannot stress hard enough how important that consistency is, because it's going to save you time, right? If you're consistent in your process and you can nail that monitoring process down to consistency, then it's going to take you much less time to perform those monitoring visits. Inspection is still going to take time. It's hard to mitigate the amount of time needed to gather all of the information to make good, solid starting decisions. But from that point forward, your monitoring process will take you substantially less time if it's based on a solid inspection foundation. So talk a little bit about the instruments, the process behind the instruments themselves. Once we're done with the instrumentation side of it, we got to figure out where to put this stuff, right? So the data's got to go somewhere. We got to capture this. And again, there's a couple of different schools of thought here. We have the old school method of pen and paper. We have the digital method. I've had a lot of practice with both. And I'm going to be honest with you and say that each organization is different. The way your organization is set up and built is going to be different from the next. So instead of telling you one is better than the other, instead I want to throw at you several questions that you need to be able to ask yourself so that you can understand which of these is better, okay? But to get to that, let's first talk about what you're going to document. Right? In terms of monitoring, here's what needs to be documented. At a minimum with building materials, we need to document the assembly that's being monitored, the component that we're specifically targeting, the room we're in, the meter we're using, the setting it's on, the value obviously that we get from the instrument, and obviously whatever dry standard or dry goal we're using as a benchmark to indicate completion at a bare bones minimum. In terms of conditions, temperature, humidity, et cetera, we need to have temperature, relative humidity, grains at a minimum, dew point and vapor pressure, very nice. An affected area or areas, unaffected area or areas, the outdoor. If you're running inter-air drying systems, we need to understand what they're doing, any dehumidification systems, any HVAC systems. Again, just bare bones minimum for what needs to be collected. That's a lot of data. That's a lot of information. So where do I put it? Digital or paper? Okay, so let me ask you a few questions, and this will hopefully lead your organization to understanding which of these methods is most appropriate for you. It's all based on time. right? So at the end of the day, I want good data, but I want to mitigate the amount of time that I'm spending doing it. So here are a few things to think about. Number one, training. Okay. So what is it going to take to ensure that my entire team of technicians, project managers, or anybody else in the field that's going to touch documentation is going to be able to capture and interpret that information the same way? Okay. At first glance, in most organizations, you think, well, everybody knows how to use paper and a pencil. Not everybody knows how to use, a digital application. But you've got to think about all of the parts and pieces that need to be done the same way. And controlling that on paper and pen is difficult, not impossible, but it's difficult depending on your organization. Okay. Accessing the project data. And to me, this is a side that starts to really lean digital. If I've got information in the field that's on pen and paper, that information is only available to the field until I can bring it back and put it in the file cabinet, right? And then once it's in the file cabinet, it's only available to the file cabinet. Access is the big promise of the digital age and one of the biggest deliverables of the digital side. Your initial project setup, how long does it take to get your documentation ready to go for the field and to create that next file so that you're ready to start collecting that data? The inspection data itself, right? How easy is it to capture that data, document that information? Which one of these makes best sense for you? Capturing service and line items and things like this so that we can translate that, another step I'm going to talk about in a moment, into estimates. Capturing all the equipment that's being used and the readings off of that equipment. Incidentally, by the way, in one of the future sessions that we're going to dig into, I'm going to talk a lot about monitoring equipment specifically. I know I didn't touch on that real deeply here today, but we are going to dive pretty deep into that, do a future episode. Getting the readings captured, deploying reports. For me, this is a really big one. Once the data is captured, how do I deploy that information in a way that is going to make sense, right? That it's going to be easy and quick to consume by the stakeholders that need to see that report. I spent a lot of my career doing in the training field, training applied structural drawing, the IICRC certification for applied structural drawing. Some of you may even have had a chance to go through class with me. And one of the struggles that was very, very real in those courses was trying to help the technician take a paper monitoring form and transform that into a report or a presentation that made sense to all of the other, knowledgeable technicians and project managers and business owners that were in that same classroom, that knew water damage, that understood water damage, but still being able to take that data and communicate what kind of progress was actually being made. Even worse yet, trying to get somebody else to understand those reports without a verbal interpretation. So how do I deploy that into reports that make sense? Right? And again, that could be a struggle on the written side. It can absolutely be a struggle. The ability and time it takes for your organization to audit reports, right? To make sure the data is being captured properly and make sure the projects are complete. And then last but not least, the ability to translate that data into an estimate, right? So which of these formats is going to best serve all of these in the most reasonable amount of time, right? And the most efficient stance from amount of time. So again, let's come back to the chain analogy. In order to get better data and spend less time capturing that data, again, I want to talk about this as though it's a chain, and every single link in this chain has to be strong. If any one of these links is weak, the process will break, right? Any one of them, it doesn't matter which one. The process starts with defining the process for your organization and training to it. This should be something that you touch on weekly. Right? I always use the analogy of that Monday morning production meeting. Maybe yours isn't on Monday, maybe it's Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday, or maybe it's even on Sunday, I don't know. But you need to have a regular discussion in your organization where you take a material, whatever that material is, and pick that material for the week and say, here's how we monitor this material. Take 3 minutes out of that Monday morning production meeting and focus on that one step in the process. The next week, pick a different material. The week after that, pick a different material. And just each week, focus on one thing, cover it well and short, very, very short hit, and say, this is how we do it with this material. And just reiterate, consistency is key. And the reason we all have to do it this way is because we need to be consistent. And unfortunately, we don't have one technician monitoring the same job throughout the job. And even if you did, if you've got a project manager that's got 4 different technicians feeding in reports, and every one of those technicians is monitoring differently, how's that project manager going to make heads and tails out of how to interpret one method of monitoring and numbers and documentation versus another. They can't, right? And they're going to make false statements unknowingly about what's happening on a project because they just don't understand the data that's in front of them. So, and even just for communicating outwardly to other stakeholders, that technician, or that consistency rather, is key. Once you define and train to the process, the next link in the chain is making sure that you do the meter maintenance, right? Making sure that you're committed to a make and model, and making sure that you're ensuring those make and models all agree from kit A to kit B to kit C, and at least monthly, right? Checking those instruments against one another. Then inspect with detail. That's the third part of this chain that makes it work. You do need to inspect with detail, which means it's the picture and not the video, right? That's ensuring that I have a high level of resolution. I understand the extent of migration. I know what the components are that are affected. I'm identifying those components that are going to be the most difficult to dry within that assembly and focusing on those for my monitoring. Once I inspect with detail, we identify the component, as I just got ahead of myself there, and then monitor consistently, right? And again, this is that area where we got to really kind of, using a Stephen R. Covey phrase, sharpen the saw, right? You got to really focus on consistency. Same meter, model, same setting, same location. Even the location piece is something you should practice as a method in your organization. And in making sure that all of that is repeated from monitoring visit to monitoring visit. Then obviously from a drying perspective, use the monitoring data to make decisions, right? And that's the other thing that we're going to spend a lot of time on in a future episode, is how do I make adjustments to my drying system based on this data? What kind of adjustments do I make? And how do I adjust what I'm doing to respond to this? If you're making progress, adjustment may not necessarily be necessary, but if you're not making progress, you've probably heard the definition of the word insanity before, right? Doing the same thing over and over and expecting something different to occur. If it's not drying and you don't change your drying system and you expect it to start working, you're insane, right? Clinical definition of insanity. So it's important to make those adjustments to the drying system when monitoring does not indicate that progress. And then the final step is inspect to verify. And that's the part that we haven't touched on yet. So we begin the monitoring and inspection process with an inspection, right? Then we monitor in the middle of the drying process. And when things indicate that they are dry, or indicate that they're not drying for that matter, we go back to the inspection hat, right? Get more detail and more information. If things are drying and are nearing completion, that inspection is to validate that that one monitoring point has been a representation of that area, right? Don't pull off a project until you put your inspection hat back on and get a little more detail again to make sure that that one location that you've been checking is representative of the area that you've been monitoring. But once we're done with that, you got to evaluate your process and your method and go all the way back to square one and define and train all over again, right? It's a cycle, continuous cycle. I've had somebody once tell me that, and don't take this the wrong way, but we are all, subconsciously incompetent in what we do, subconsciously incompetent. And through the process of discovery, through being in the field and doing work, or maybe even making a mistake, eventually we become conscious of the fact that we're incompetent in some way, right? Because we're not perfect, nobody's perfect. So we find something that, hey, that didn't work, that's broken, that's not working right. So then we find a resolution and we work towards becoming consciously competent. Right? We continue to work on whatever that failure was, whatever that breakdown was in the chain, right? And then as we practice that technique, that trade, eventually we become subconsciously competent in whatever we were working on. But then we've got to, again, remember all the way back at the beginning, we're still subconsciously incompetent in something else. What does all that mean? It means that this is a cycle. Right? So as we define and train and we inspect and we monitor and then we inspect to verify, we need to learn from that process what works and doesn't work, adjust how we're defining and training, and then continue to train through the process. It's a continuous cycle that'll never be complete, right? But the more you complete this cycle, the more you're going to manage risk, the more you're going to manage liability. And more importantly, maybe not more importantly, but just as importantly, the more profitable your business will become, because honing this skill is what allows you to be more aggressive with your drying approach, right? And one of the things I'm a definite advocate for is this industry exists to minimize the building materials that need to be replaced, right? And the more I can dry and the less I need to replace by validating with a good monitoring process, the more profitable I become as an organization, right? My profit margin on restorative drying is much, much greater than my profit margin on remodeling, right? It's much, much greater. So the more I can hone my organization that way, the more dollars and cents are going to stay in the bank account at the end of every year. So that's the core of our subject matter for today. At this point, I just want to remind everybody as I come into a wrap here, make sure that if you have any questions that you had as I went through the material today, you drop those into the Q&A. I'm going to really quickly close out the recorded side of this. And just for those that are catching this as a recorded sometime in the future, I want a couple things I want to cover off on here, and then we're going to jump into the Q&A. So again, this was episode 1 of Technically Speaking, monitoring moisture. We have 12 episodes planned for this year, one every month. It's going to vary a little bit on exactly what day of the month it'll be, but we'll make sure we get some emails and notifications out to you. My name is Brandon Burton. I'm the Vice President of Technical Application here at CoreLogic. I'm also the chair of the IICRC and ANSI standards. So feel free to reach out to me with any questions on the content from today, water damage mitigation in general, on standards, or anything technical in the water damage mitigation industry. I love nothing more than spending time on technical topics in this industry. Here's the slate of episodes we have planned for this year. The next one up is going to be advanced atmospheric readings. Absolutely love geeking out on atmospheric readings. So that's going to be a really fun episode. The plan is to have that episode come out February 15th at 10 a.m. Pacific, 12 Central. So mark that on your calendars to make sure that you're available for that episode, and we'll be excited to bring that to you.